So it was recently announced by Marvel Television that Cloak and Dagger will be featured in a crossover episode on the next season of Marvel's Runaways on Hulu. So I was like, well, I guess I'd better watch Runaways. It's currently 2 seasons in, but I just finished watching season 1. Honestly though, about halfway through the season, I was like, why didn't I stick with this when it first came out? I'll explain what I mean a little later, but for now, let's talk about this cool show. Marvel's Runaways, Season 1. So Runaways is another Marvel TV show supposedly set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's totally not, though. Like, throughout this entire season, I spotted 0 references to anything. So really, it's its own thing. So Runaways revolves around the group of teenagers that are in high school. They used to be good friends back in the day, but the death of one of these kids' sisters caused them to drift apart. Their parents are part of a group called Pride, which on the outside is like a charitable organization of sorts. They have an annual meeting once a year. So the meeting happens once again, and the teens get back together. And through a series of events, the teens discover that Pride is not just a charitable organization. They find out that Pride is actually some sort of evil ritualistic cult that deals with some pretty weird bizarro shit. So now these teens have to find a way to face their parents. To me, that's just so unique of a premise that just makes it really interesting. But honestly, the reason I actually like this show is because the kids themselves are interesting characters. How are they interesting, you might ask? Well, it turns out that each one of them discovers they have powers of their own, as in like superpowers of sorts. A lot of times throughout this season, I was like, this is like Big Hero 6, but live action, and a little more drama heavy. And I'm gonna go through each of these characters because that's kind of what I do here. I always go through the characters. First off, we have Alex Wilder, played by Renzi Feliz. He's the first of the main kids we meet in the show, and he's actually the only one who doesn't have any like superpowers, but he's actually super smart. Like, he's a prodigy. He's like the tactician. He's really good at like computer hacking and stuff, decrypting files and all that. He's always the one who lays out the plans for the group. And he has something of a romantic history with Nico Minoru, played by Lyrica Okana, one of the more interesting characters in the show. Turns out she comes from a line of witches, or at least her mother's a witch. She can wield this staff, this magic staff called the Staff of One, and it'll pretty much do whatever she wants it to do. Nico's actually the one whose sister died originally, causing the group to fall apart, which is also the reason she dresses goth now, but it kind of fits with the whole witch vibe, you know? She's really standoffish, she'd rather not talk to anyone, she's kind of bitter, which is why this group of kids is good for her. Then we have Chase Stein, played by Greg Sulkin of all people, not doing the best American accent I've heard from a Brit, but his character starts out as kind of the stereotypical jock, but it turns out he's actually a pretty cool dude and kind of a nerd. He's also pretty smart. He invents these devices he calls fistigons. They're like power gauntlets. They shoot beams out of them. Pretty cool. His father is also like a freaking genius, like on level with Tony Stark, and it really shows in this show. He's actually just a brilliant guy, which is why it makes sense that he's played by Brainiac from Smallville. He was also just a brilliant guy in that show. In fact, the relationship that Chase has with his father is one of the more interesting story arcs of this whole season, I thought. I'll touch on that a little later because I'm not done talking about the kids yet. Karolina Dean, played by Virginia Gardner, at first she's seen as like the really happy church girl because her parents work for this church and so they're like this super religious family. But from the get-go, I could tell, yeah, Karolina, she hates her life. She doesn't want to be this poster child for a church. That's not who she is. And in that aspect, I probably relate to her the most. There's not much that bothers me more than super duper religious parents, like the mom from Carrie or something. It's not quite that bad, but it's almost there. So like Karolina, I would be like, yeah, that's your thing. I don't want to be a part of that. I have nothing against religion. It's just not my thing. But it turns out Karolina has one of the weirdest powers of all of them. She's been wearing this church bracelet her whole life. Once she takes it off for the first time, it turns out that her arms can glow and she can shoot beams of light and fly. She's like Starfire from Teen Titans. Visually, it doesn't look that great. So what keeps me interested is that she's actually an interesting character. So when she starts glowing for the first time, I was like, holy shit. Then we have Gert Yorks, played by Ariella Bearer. Probably my favorite of the kids. Like, she and Nico are like my favorite characters, so far anyway. But Gert's power is probably the coolest. See, her parents are like these bioengineers of sorts. They experiment with living creatures and stuff. And somehow they have managed to genetically create a dinosaur, like a raptor. And for reasons not explained yet, not in season 1 anyway, Gert has kind of a telepathic link with this thing, so it'll obey her, do whatever she says. So yeah, this girl has a pet raptor. That is awesome. Gert's younger stepsister is Molly Hernandez, played by Allegra Acosta. You find out later in the season that her biological parents were murdered by Pride, and the day they were murdered, Molly was just a little kid. She was exposed to this almost like alien substance. You don't really know what it is yet by the end of season 1, but it gave her the ability to summon super strength when she's stressed, and she's damn near invincible too. And I like that this show touches on the fact that her powers aren't perfect. Whenever she uses her super strength, it wears her out. She gets really exhausted, so she has to like take a nap right afterwards, whether she wants to or not, which again makes sense because she is just a kid. She's younger than all the other teens. Like, I'd place all the other teens around 16 or 17, I'd place Molly around 13 or 14. So yeah, super strength would wear her out. And so all these kids discover they have powers and abilities of their own, and they come together to take out their evil parents. Again, it's like their Big Hero 6. And it's interesting because they have different relationships bobbing and weaving within this group. At first, it's like a love pentagon of sorts. Like Gert has a crush on Chase, who has a crush on Karolina, who has a crush on Nico, who has a romantic history with Alex. Yeah, that's how it is. It does all resolve by the end of this season, I think in a pretty cool way. I'm not gonna spoil it for you, just go watch it. However, do I think the show is completely perfect? No, I don't. See, the show is called Runaways. That's pretty much the name of this group of teens, so you see them as the main characters. But honestly, at quite a few points throughout this season, I felt like it was touching more on the parents of these kids than the kids themselves. Yeah, the show spends a lot of time focusing on the evil parents, which makes sense. You know, in any superhero anything, the villain has to have a fair amount of screen time. You have to see what the villains are up to so you're not in complete shock when they show up at the end of the movie to throw down with the heroes. I get it, and that would be fine with me if the parents were as interesting as their kids, but the fact is, they're not. At least not to me. When this show first came out in late 2017, I actually watched the first couple episodes. I thought episode 1 was pretty good. It focused on the kids discovering that their parents are actually evil. It was interesting. But then episode 2 retells the same story as episode 1, but from the parents' perspective. And to me, it was just not nearly as interesting as the first episode. What can I say? I guess I still relate more to teenagers than adults at this point. So I stopped watching after episode 2. But since it was announced that they're having a crossover episode with Cloak and Dagger in their next season, I figured I should probably pick it up again. So I watched the whole season and I actually thought it was pretty good, but the parents are still not that interesting. Except for Chase's father, Victor Stein, because again, the relationship they have throughout the season, it kept me on the edge of my seat. Because at first he's like an abusive father to a really bad degree, like he physical violence, I mean, it's bad. Then at a point in this season, it looks like he is regretting it and he wants to actually form a good bond with his son. And I actually fell into it. I was like, wow, maybe he actually is regretting being abusive. Where that story arc goes this season, I thought was just really interesting. But honestly, the whole villainous plan of Pride, the thing that they're trying to do, I didn't really care for it that much. They're just weird, evil adults being weird and evil. They're being led by this guy, Jonah, who I don't think is from around this planet. But it's funny, when he first showed up on screen, I was like, I know that face, it's killing me. Where have I seen him before? So I looked it up. He was Dr. Doom in the Tim Story Fantastic Four movies. Holy shit, what a throwback. I'm glad he got another chance to play a good Marvel villain. He's mysterious. I'm still not sure what his whole deal is yet. Maybe I'll find out in season 2. If for nothing else, he's interesting-ish. Not as interesting as Chase's dad. Or Gert's parents, the Yorkses. They're like cartoonishly eccentric, which also made them kind of interesting, but really it's the fact that they're bioengineers. That's what really makes them interesting. I don't know, I just like their story arc this season. The music in Runaways, it's alright. The score is done by Siddhartha Khosla, and it's okay, but I usually skip the intro of the show, like I do with most shows. The only shows where I don't skip the intro are Game of Thrones and Stranger Things. All of their shows, including this one, I skip the intro. Besides, like with most TV shows, it's more about the soundtrack. And there are actually a couple songs I heard in the show where I was like, that's a good beat. I want to find that song. That cheerleading scene being one of them, tell me that's not a good beat. Just saying. So yeah, there are some pretty good jams in the soundtrack. In the end, I really like Runaways Season 1. Like I said, I don't find the villainous parents to be nearly as interesting as the heroic teens, and you'd think that would weigh it down for me, but the kids are just so interesting in this show that it outweighs how not interesting the parents are. I love the strong chemistry between all these runaways. I love their powers. I think they're really cool. The relationships between all of them, I thought they were really well done. In many ways, the show is about self-discovery, finding out and accepting who you really are and owning it. I think that's kick-ass. And I'm looking forward to watching season 2. Pretty great show overall. I regret not watching it when it first came out, but better late than never. So Marvel's Runaways season 1. Have you watched it? What did you think about it? Whatever you think, go ahead and leave a comment. And please don't spoil season 2. And don't forget to subscribe.